Hello and welcome. Helmet already has me laughing and we've only just started, so that's not a bad beginning to this episode of Doctors Schuster and Oxley, The Power of Stories. I thought I'd open this particular podcast with a couple of quotes. I was struck by this one particular quote from Derek Thompson. One might say that the chaos of life is a chronic condition for which stories are the remedy. I love that. Right, the idea that we live in this world where it's so complex and there's information hitting us all over the place, that stories create a thread that helps us make sense of it all. I thought that was great. Did that make sense to you?
Yeah,
that quote?
Good. Yeah.
Well, the other one was
David, you're always brilliant. Yeah, I know you like to hear that, but in fact you are. The depth of you. It took me like 3 minutes to think about what it meant, and then I figured, wow, that's really good. So thank you.
And how about this one? After nourishment, shelter, and companionship, stories are the things that we need most in the world. How do you think about that? After nourishment, shelter, and companionship, stories are the thing we need most in the world.
I think companionship are also about stories. I wouldn't only call it story, but conversations. Yeah, I think after the basic needs in life, it's so important to be in dialogue. And just remember, we've spent a lot of time in dialogue, in conversations. So yes, I agree with that. I could not disagree at all.
So basically, quotes to reinforce our belief that stories are an underutilized mechanism for us to make sense of the world, but particularly in a professional sense. So we've dedicated this podcast, and to some very large extent, we've dedicated our post-corporate lives to trying to help pass on some wisdom to unlock the potential for a generation of professionals entering the workplace that might feel that it is absurd, chaotic, a puzzle that's difficult to decode. And let me first of all say, yes, it is. All of those things. Professional life is complex and overwhelming and intimidating. And so what we've been trying to do is to use stories to try and create sense from that, to try and help generate meaning. With a little bit of success, I'd like to think. And this podcast is another attempt at doing exactly that. Would you agree, Helmut?
Absolutely. And my dear David, podcasting was your idea. I like writing. Yeah, I was very introverted when I was young. I hated public speaking. I still don't like it very much. But I start actually enjoying these podcasts, which is quite interesting. Yeah, considering my age, that start liking things I've never done really before. So that's a good thing. Thank you very much, David, for that.
In this particular episode, we're going to focus on one of Dr. Helmut Schuster's personal stories, one that's very dear to him. I'm going to pass it over to him in a moment, but we'll talk about this story. Helmut will intro it, tell us a little bit about who the person was, his coach that inspired him when he was a young prodigy, a prospect for Olympic swimming medals. And then we'll talk about the story itself, and then we'll unpick it, because I think there's always fun and insight. And there's a certain alchemy that when Helmut and I find whenever we're talking about these stories, that thoughts crop up in your head, and it illustrates why we think they're so powerful. But let me just pass it straight over to Helmut now and let him intro the story.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. The reason I picked the story, and as I mentioned before, I'm not the greatest storyteller, I start enjoying it now, but I always have stories in my mind, in my head. So I think it was 2 weeks ago that Thomas, my swim mate from the good olden times in my home country, went to see Hannelore. And she's basically the main character in this whole story now. I think she must be now 81, 82, and she was our swim coach. And she was far more than a swim coach. She was a mentor. She was basically a second mother. It's just amazing to see her still being very active, swimming every morning, and that inspired me actually, reflected, what did she actually do for me and us in her life, and that was a lot. Laura, it has to be said, was an Olympian. She basically swam at the Rome Olympics, which I think were in 62 in the 60s. But she was also, and that was actually at these times, not uncommon, she was also like a champion figure skater. I mean, you couldn't imagine that, but she was basically a swimmer and a figure skater. And she swam butterfly, which is like one of the hardest strokes there is. But the reason I tell this story is, and a bit of context, I was born just outside Vienna in a little resort area, so swimming was always something I did. My parents taught me to swim probably 3 or 4 years. It was not until a few years later that friends said, well, there's this cool swimming club and the coach is so cool, she's very strict, but she was a champion swimmer. She basically met Muhammad Ali at the Olympics and they're befriended. So it was a really cool story, and so I said, yeah, I'm going to join you guys. And I actually did enjoy it. So there was a community of young people, and there must have been like 10, 11, I guess, at the time. And they really enjoyed that. And they figured, okay, I'm going to share that with my best friend at the time, Thomas. We went to school together. And said, Thomas, why don't you actually join swimming? It could be so nice, and which he did. And then it turned out Thomas took it far more serious than I did it. For me, it was a nice thing, social thing to go swimming. So within, I think, 6 months, we ended up swimming before school, so before we went to school, swimming in the afternoon after school. And a few years later, we started competing, so most weekends were gone. And I still remember I really enjoyed it when there was a swim training and there was a thunderstorm and lightning and it was outside, and they basically, Hannelore, the name of our coach, said, well, listen, we need to make a short break because it's too risky to be in the water when there's lightning. And then she took me aside and said, come, let's have a conversation, Helmut. Yeah, let's have a conversation. And I said, cool. And she said, you know, Thomas has been winning quite a few medals lately, and you haven't. And I said, yes. And it didn't really bother me that Thomas was a great swimmer, and so I there was no jealousy. I really enjoyed it that he was successful. I said, like, you know, you do realize you're equally talented. You probably have the same talent as Thomas has. But what you don't have is actually Thomas every time, at every training, gives 100% all the time. And Helmut, you give 80% most, yeah? And I said, like, what's wrong with that? I still enjoy it, show up. And he said, listen, I give you one advice, yeah? If you spend so much time doing something, you might as do it extremely well and give your best. Otherwise, you might find something which inspires you more, your passion is your heart, yeah? And at the time it was quite academic, so that you might actually enjoy reading books or do other things, yeah? But think about that, yeah? And it was such, and she probably doesn't even realize that. She probably even forgot it, yeah? It was such a shock for me, yeah? It was basically humiliating, and I felt like really caught out. I felt really bad about that. I thought about it, and I figured, no, I'm not gonna give up, yeah? So it was like this thing, sometimes you get this grit, yeah? I figured, no, I'm gonna swim, I'm gonna win, and I'm gonna be really, really good. And so I started, yeah, I really gave 100%. It was painful, it was not easy, it took huge discipline. I started doing like push-ups and pull-ups and everything at home in my free time after school. And, you know, I was rewarded. And just as a sign here, I brought a few like handful of my things. These are all the medals.
Oh my gosh!
And, like championships and the whole.
You don't have them in a case, you know, in one of these presentation cases.
No, humility. David, we talked about humility. Be humble. That's the message in our books, humility. No, I don't. But I just got them out of the basement a few days ago and realized, well, they're still there. And there's one actually in America. It's Wisconsin. Triangle Conference in Wisconsin, so which I must have won at one point in time. But the message is, and I think this is the important thing, yeah? And I heard her loud and clear in this moment, and it probably was a conversation which didn't take much more than 5 minutes, really did shape my life. And the thing was, whatever you do the 100%, yeah, and never give up. And I must have been like 12, 13 at the time, and it changed my entire life for the better, I think. So what do you think about the story, David?
Yes. First of all, I feel it should Should get a little applause.
Applause, thank you so much.
Possibly some cheering because of your medal winning. The Olympic crowd going crazy as you get your medal. I love the story, and I relate to it because a lot of and I don't know how many people in Europe had a similar experience. We seem to go through a phase where our parents were very keen for us to swim. So I relate to it because I can actually, in terms of the story itself, I can transpose myself back to when I was 11 or 12 and swimming, now in my case not every day, but 3 times a week at the local swimming pool with the local club. Indeed, that's where I met my wife, albeit that she doesn't remember at the time because I was always behind her. So there are a number of aspects of the story that ring true. And this idea that someone in your early life took you aside and possibly didn't overthink it, that there was a moment and it somehow really struck you, it really resonated. You talked about being in the pool with lightning. In a way, what she said to you metaphorically was a lightning bolt to your consciousness, to why am I doing this? What's it all for? So I love this idea that we have a routine, we're doing something, but we're not applying ourselves in doing it. It's become a habit, but not one that we have consciously asked ourselves the question, what meaning does this have to me? What is it that I'm trying to achieve? I like that. I think it's extraordinarily powerful.
Well, what I found, and I've been reflecting on this for a long time, and I think often we do not appreciate the talent or the potential we're given by our parents, by whatever DNA. I think we sometimes take things for granted, yeah. I took it for granted, yeah, that my parents gave me the privilege to be able to swim at the age of 3 or 4. I took it for granted, yeah, that I basically just was very good in the water. I took it for granted that butterfly was easy for me. I took all that for granted. And, I just didn't appreciate. And I think the message Hannelore gave me saying, talent without discipline is literally nothing, but a nice thing, yeah. You can dwell on it, you can be proud of it, but it's not worth basically just even reflecting on that. And she basically, and I've seen that so many times in corporate life, there's so many talented people, we put them in high potential schemes, yeah, and they believe, yeah, because they have great schools, because they basically have great reputation, because they're very gifted speakers, yeah, they have a good brain, that they earn promotions. The reality is the best people are the people who have to work very, very hard for what they do. When you think about, like Madonna is a great example. I think she's wonderful. She was never the greatest singer. When you think about Madonna, her voice is really not great, yeah? And I hope she doesn't listen to that. But she, in my opinion, was the most disciplined artist ever. And she was driven, and she wanted to be famous, and she was the best dancer. And I think that's often in life. And go back to swimming. There were basically Phelps and Ryan Lochte. And they probably were pretty equally talented, but Phelps won everything because, and the story goes, that he practiced every single day, 365 days, because it gave him an advantage in the pool of 5 days, yeah. And I think discipline is a superpower which is not valued enough. And so I think that's very important, yeah. And that's a message I really would like to convey, that discipline is something nobody really writes about, but discipline is one of the most important things. And I see that in all the startups I've invested in, there's some founders who basically give everything, 120% every day, and I'm pretty certain that they will make it. In the business world, It's not always the most exciting, most charismatic. It's the hardest working people who create great value for companies.
But if I go back to your story, and I think everything you just said, I completely resonate with, but I sort of see four things that I'd at least like to call out, and we can pick up on any of them if you like. The first is this idea we drift into things, that we don't really interrogate deeply why. And I'll use my example rather than yours because I can speak for myself. But I drifted into swimming because my parents said you need to go and learn to swim. Perhaps it was to do with the Titanic, or I don't know what it was. You have to learn to swim, and we did this thing where we had to tie our pajama bottoms up and then inflate it so that we could float if we were ever somehow lost at sea. But I never interrogated deeply why I did it. I did it to some extent because I was an obedient child. So whether it be going to Sunday school, whether it be all of the things I did through my early life, which were done somewhat on automatic pilot, but they weren't really consciously interrogated. I sort of either drifted or was pushed into certain things. And so it was quite easy for me to, nod off at the back of the church service, or I wasn't there because I had some sort of deep conviction about it beyond the fact that that was what my life entailed, that they were the expectations. It was like doing homework after school. I didn't particularly enjoy the subjects, but I had to do them because I couldn't have any TV time until I'd done my homework. So you check the task. And the minute you go from this drifting to saying, no, I consciously want to do it. And so at school, I found a couple of outlets that I loved to do. I loved to play sports, but not necessarily swimming, but I loved to play cricket, and I loved to play a sport called badminton. And I found myself fully committed to that. And then in being committed to that, I found the right people to say, well, if you want to be good at this, you need to do these things. And then I found that because I had a motivation to do it, I was consciously engaged in it, that I was then prepared to commit to the discipline. Where some of these other things that I was still drifting and doing, not necessarily as a routine, it was a routine, but I was doing it in an obedient way rather than necessarily in a fully committed way. And if I translate that to work, I saw that every day in the office, that people were in meetings because they didn't have a commitment to the subject, but because they felt obligated to be there, that they were either using it as a means by which to promote their own brand, or even worse, they were there just to make up their numbers because you want to be included, you don't want to be excluded, but you weren't really participating. So I think that realization, the gift that someone gives you when they call you out and say, now, what is it that you want to get out of this? Are you conscious that you're here sort of in body, but not necessarily in mind? And are you okay with that? Isn't it just a big waste of your time unless you actually then make the next step to commit? I find that very powerful. It's a very powerful observation.
Yeah, I think you said something which I think is very important. We probably should dedicate a podcast to the topic of conscious choices. Because I find that in the corporate life that most things just occur, but nobody ever took a conscious choice that these things should be the way they are. Most of the meetings in your diary, you think somebody made a conscious choice to have this meeting on that day, but in reality it's just the corporate machine. In BP we always call it the corporate machine, yeah? There's this corporate machine, this steamer, this train, and once the train has left the station, you just don't make conscious choices. And I think this is a topic which I see all the time in large corporations, in smaller corporations. In very small startups, I think I see far more behavior that people reflect deeply and then make conscious choices what to do and what not to do. And David, you remember BP had at one point in time, I think we had like almost 3,000 people policies. And I'm sure most of these policies, were not the result of conscious choices to keep them. It's like, I mean, there's so many laws in the world that nobody has ever seen, and we just create
layer
more
on
and
layer.
more and more and layer, and nobody understands this whole thing, but it's all a drift. And I like the word drift because most things in this world is a drift. Very few decisions the result of conscious choices. And I think it's really worth talking about that and also writing about that, yeah? The power of conscious choices.
Yeah. And if I think through some of the writing that we've done, I see the story resonate. And it's fascinating because I wonder how consciously we are of all of this stuff going on in our minds, that we collaborate on our writing, and sometimes we'll look at one another and say, well, where did that idea come from? Where did that story come from? And we simply go, well, it's in the back of our minds. It's something that has happened to us that we're now reimagining or explaining. I see this story, your story, about your swim coach saying, you're here in body, but you're not really committed. You haven't taken that step to say, if I'm going to invest my time in this, then I want to be as good as I can. I see that in some of our writing. I see that coming out when we talk about what is the secret of unpicking? What are the challenges that we face in the professional world? And one big one that is just a recurring theme is, do you go to work in a transactional sense to tick the boxes, to go to the meetings, to say and be seen in the right places? Or do you go with a sense of purpose and conviction to achieve something? And I think the difference between the people that show up in one category versus the other is extraordinary. When you come across someone who has conviction in something, then it's infectious. You get carried along. I have sat through, and I'm not exaggerating, 4-hour meetings where the person doing the presentation is simply reading the PowerPoint slides, and it feels very compliant, very pedestrian. It feels like we're there because somehow someone said, and you probably know the situations I'm referring to, that a corporate initiative requires us to talk about a subject. Someone has decided on the 5th floor that everyone needs to talk about this subject. Now go away and do a presentation on it. And it's a bit soul crushing because no one in the room is particularly committed to the cause. But that's I push back on that and say, if you're going to do it well, be committed to it, or don't do it. Or even more bravely, courageously say, hey guys, is this, it may be a good subject, but it's an enormous waste of time how we're going about doing it. We're wasting our effort here. That requires a certain amount of courage, which is very hard to do.
Yeah, I mean, I've reflected on that a lot. So I truly believe most people who basically work in large corporations have one concern, to basically maintain status quo, because they have created a lifestyle where they basically depend on monthly paychecks. I mean, just think about that. If you have your own thing, yeah, you never know. Is money coming in? Is money not coming in? Corporate life, in many ways, like easy revenue cash streams, yeah. It might be soul crushing sometimes, and you might not have a lot of autonomy or space, yeah. But there's one thing you have. You have relative certainty that you will have a monthly income, cash coming in. And if the company basically decides to separate, you know that they will give you some money, so that you basically have a year or so to sort yourself out. Yeah? And I think working for a large corporation, or any corporation, is in many ways an easy choice. Yeah? It's like me going to the swimming pool every day, basically giving 70-80%, yeah? Spending hours in the pool. And then the coach so simply says, like, why did you just do 100%? And you might get some like winnings, and you might be on the podium, and you might get that. And then the joy of really just delivering something, saying, wow, I can win, yeah. Wow, I can get medals, yeah. Wow, actually we have like people applauding, yeah. That is a completely different, but I think in the corporate world we don't find it that often. Yeah?
But I think that point, and this is a point perhaps that we can end this episode on, the difference in you, and again, most of our writing, in fact, all of our writing is really directed at the individual. We focus not on solving the institutional or societal problems in which we inevitably bang up against in our lives. It's more, how do we cope? How do we cope? How do we navigate? How do we get the best out of ourselves? One of the things I think we say quite often in our writings is, in our time trying to coach organizations to try and help them be more effective, to be a high performing organization, typically it starts with individuals. Typically it starts with, how do you get the best out of a team? Well, you have to get the best out of each of the individuals. You have to try and help them be the best versions of themselves. And the difference between the individual who's figured out and has some conviction about what it is that they're fighting for, versus the individual that's there in order to score points, make up the numbers, and check the box, is extraordinary, right? The energy is infectious with the person who has the conviction. And I do believe that they're the ones that actually get more energy as the day goes on, as opposed to those individuals at 6 o'clock in the evening that are just dog tired and want to go home, that have sort of faced the tyranny of the bureaucracy of the day. I think, so in that sense, the story is not only, if you're going to put the time in, why not put 100% in rather than 80? But in the process, 80% doesn't feel as hard as, 100% doesn't feel as hard as 80, because at 100%, you're really committed to something and it doesn't feel like work. It doesn't feel like a burden. Whereas at 80%, you're kind of dialing it in and it's more of a drain. Would you agree with that?
Well, for corporate role, they probably would agree. For swimming, I mean, I have to say, the swim interval training, 10 times 100 butterfly, and every time 100%. David, be my guest. You can join me once. It's tough. It's really, really tough. Yeah, it takes a lot of it takes a discipline.
But how did you feel afterwards? In the moment, it's exhausting. But no, afterwards, did the endorphins didn't kick in?
They did, and the feeling was saying, "Wow, I did really well." Yeah, I mean, it's just like being amazed how much your body actually can do, going to your limits, going out of your comfort zone. Yeah. I mean, really, that's like my advice to the audience, try to get out of your comfort zone. Like being here, doing a podcast, it's so outside my comfort zone, yeah? I thought when I left the corporate world, I never had to do public speaking again. Here I am with Dr. David Oxley, and I actually
it's just a conversation. Well, yeah, it's not, yeah, good. Okay, well, I won't belabor that. I'll take where you are and not try and disturb that. Okay, let's wrap this particular episode up. This episode of Dr. Schuster and Oxley, The Power of Stories. And today we shared the story of Helmut's swimming coach, the ex-Olympian. I'm fascinated by the fact that she was also did you say ice skating? That she did?
Well, she was an ice skater. She made a conscious choice to become a swimmer, yeah. But she used to be ice skater and swimmer, and she made a conscious choice, believing that she could become a world-class swimmer, yeah. And that was quite amazing, yeah. And she's an amazing woman. She still is amazing. Yeah? 82 now, 81.
Incredibly powerful intervention that she made with our dear Dr. Schuster. Who knows where he would have been today had this lady not made the intervention at his tender age of 12 or 13. He could still be languishing somewhere in the suburbs of Vienna, as opposed to having conquered the world in his various guises. But there's a serious point here beyond the joking, that we are a sort of sum of our parts, that all of these little nudges that we've had throughout our life that we remember, some that perhaps we don't remember, has somehow got us the open doors that have enabled us to progress to where we are. And I hope ultimately we help people get to a stage in their lives where they look back and go, I'm glad that we got where we got to. Our podcasts are designed to inspire through storytelling. This story has been a very personal and a very powerful one from Dr. Schuster. If you like the If you like the podcast, check out the other podcasts that we've recorded. Check out our social media, which continues to amaze us. Check out our LinkedIn, our newsletter, which this month is about to go out next week. And read the books. I cannot emphasize this more than simply read the books. If you like this podcast, you'll love the books. You'll love the books if you like this podcast. Actually, even if you don't like this podcast, you'll still love the books. That's important. So with that, let me say it's goodbye from me.
And you'll love the books. Goodbye from me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.